when you take a look at the technology space, it's been under a lot of heat for struggling with diversity and inclusion efforts. To what extent do you think Silicon Valley has made progress in embracing D&I, and how real is that embracement?
Well, I think it has made a lot of progress, though it's taken quite a bit of time, right? Like many other industries and many other companies, the Silicon Valleys, they started off when the tech companies first started, they really believed that they were going to create a better kind of company that was focused on meritocracy and built on egalitarianism. But like so many other humans, when those early founders began creating their companies, they hired within their own image without realizing it. And they ended up with these companies that were largely male, that were largely white and Asian in their leadership. And a lot of Silicon Valley companies had to be pulled into diversity and inclusion. And when they first began focusing on it, they said, okay, we'll focus on D&I, but we'll focus on fixing the women that are here, focusing on the minorities that are here and fixing them. But in the last few years, one of the big things that I've realized is that a lot of Silicon Valley companies are realizing, Uber included, that it's not simply about fixing the women or bringing more women in or fixing the minorities, but it's about fixing the culture within which they work. Looking at the systems, looking at the culture of egalitarianism and saying, is this truly egalitarian?
The thing is, change is not happening fast enough. You talk about how it is mainly male, mainly Asian. It's happening at Uber. I mean, what's your own strategy to change that very quickly?
Well, the first strategy is looking at our leadership and saying, are they committed? Are they truly committed? And if they're not there, how can we get our leaders to improve? Because in all the years that I've worked in diversity and inclusion, if the leaders aren't on board, nothing's really going to change. So the strategy with Uber, start with the leadership, cascade from there. Also focus on transparency and accountability. One of the biggest changes that I introduced when I joined Uber was simply making our workforce data available to our leaders. Up until that point, our leaders had no idea what their teams looked like, what their leadership looked like, and now they do. And so I can ask them, hey, do you really think that these choices we're making are the right choices given the diversity of your workforce?
Not everybody's buying into that effort. Ellen Powell has been pretty critical. She says that despite the departure of Kalanick, very little has changed at Uber. What would you say to her?
Well, I would say to Ellen, come and talk to me. I would love to show you exactly what we're doing, because we are looking at the root causes of what creates the disparity in our organization and trying to address those at that most systemic level. I'm not running a bunch of training classes. I'm not running a bunch of developmental classes. What I'm really looking at is, hey, let's look at our performance management system. Let's look at our promotion system. Let's look at our recruiting processes. Let's root out the bias that's there and find ways to ensure that our culture can really reflect the norms, the behaviors that women, that people of color naturally exhibit.
You talk about how you're holding your leadership accountable. How quickly do you think you'll see results from that? Because as it stands now, even when it comes to the gender pay issue, it'll take another 60, 80 years, 100 years even to get to parity.
Right. Well, one of the really great things is that since 2017, Uber has run pay equity analysis every 6 months. And the really great thing is that we were able to achieve pay equity across the board in aggregate since 2017. And every time we run our analysis, we've been able to achieve that. So something like pay equity, which seems like such a huge issue, if a company has the courage and the commitment, that is actually something that is relatively easy for companies to address. I think some of the harder things are looking at the built-up debt that a lot of companies have built in their leadership pipeline, in their workforce pipeline. If you've spent multiple years cultivating a certain type of leadership, when you start looking at the pipeline, you're not always going to find huge numbers of women, huge people of color, and that's when it takes a company to say, we may not have the talent internal at the levels we want. How are we going to find that talent? Either internally develop it, accelerate that development, or look into the external market to find that talent.
So what are you doing actively to get the diverse pipeline? Has it worked?
Yeah. So one of the simplest things that we've actually done is we've launched across all of our businesses a sponsorship program. What we do is we identify really high potential women, underrepresented minorities at that manager level, people who may not naturally have somebody in the leadership who's advocating on their behalf. And we've paired them with a senior leadership in their business unit who gets to know them over a long period of time, who understands what does this person need from their career development? How do I, the leader, advocate for them? And we've had tremendous success in the pilots that we've run for our sponsorship program, where these individuals feel that investment from the senior leader, and vice versa. The senior leader says, wow, I actually understand what now I understand when a woman says, I don't have the same opportunities as men. I understand what that means. And so one of the interesting things is we created a sponsorship program for those women, for those underrepresented minorities. But the great benefit is that we have this whole cadre of leaders now who are much better inclusion champions, who could actually see where systemic barriers are, and they're actively trying to remove them from our systems now.
Bo, you talked about accountability. In 5 years, how different would Uber look when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Right. Well, hopefully we'll see a huge difference in our leadership at the manager plus population. Anyone who has read our diversity report that was published this past July, you know that we've actually set public goals for 3-year goals where we've stated targets for both our representation of women at our manager plus level as well as our people of color in the U.S. And we've actually tied some of our executive comp to that goal. So we're hoping that our leadership will look very different. And by design, the purpose of having a diverse workforce, the purpose of having a diverse leadership is that our products will also look very different. So I'm hoping that in 5 years, not only will our workforce look different, not only will our leaders look different, but the way that we engage with our customers, with our driver partners, should also look different based on our workforce.
Before we let you go, Bo, I mean, it's fine concentrating on your leadership. How about in terms of buy-in among your workers who are still mainly male?
The great thing is that we actually have a lot of buy-in, and one of the reasons why we have such great buy-in is because we have defined diversity in a very broad, complex way. I think tech sometimes does itself a disservice by overly focusing on simply gender and race ethnicity. One thing that we introduced earlier this year is a significantly expanded self-ID campaign where we've asked our workforce to voluntarily identify across 8 different dimensions that include sexual orientation and gender identity, veteran status, socioeconomic status, caregiver status, and several other categories. And that allows people to say, yes, maybe a white male in Silicon Valley in San Francisco may not identify as a female or a person of color, but they'll say, hey, I have a child, or I want to have a child. I'm a caregiver. Oh, diversity and inclusion is also about me. Maybe there might be someone who, has a disability that they're afraid of disclosing. And we've just given them an opportunity to self-identify. That allows me to actually see what is their representation, what is their engagement, and then be able to address them more specifically. So we've expanded diversity and inclusion to make it something that everyone can find an identity within.